All right, everyone, we're going to get started. My name is Daniela Perry. I serve as the Vice President of the Foundation for the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. I'm excited to have two very good friends and colleagues on this morning to kind of do a legislative preview. If you've got questions, feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, and we'll continue to filter through those. But we're going to keep this very discussion-oriented and informal. So with that, excited to have Katie Duvall, who serves as the Director of Government Affairs for the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, and Tim Cairl, who serves as the Director of Educated Workforce, Tim, if that's the correct one, and then for the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. So with that, Tim, I'll let you introduce yourself and just share a little bit about the Metro Chamber and what issues you cover for the Metro Atlanta Chamber.
Thanks, Daniela. Like Daniela said, I cover education and workforce for the Metro Atlanta Chamber. I've been with the Chamber about 9 years, mainly focused on K-12 and higher ed. Some of our legislative priorities as they relate to K-12 education and workforce. We've been laser focused for a number of years around childcare and making sure that parents have access to quality, affordable childcare, mainly through the, Child and Parent Services Program, or CAPS, which is the primary subsidy that we use, some with federal funds, some with state funds, to support parents with young children. So we continually have that as a constant legislative priority for us to make sure that that system is well funded. A second one is around computer science funding for K-12 schools. We worked with the Georgia Chamber and a number of partners. Since 2018, we've expanded computer science education in the state. And we continue to keep that as a constant funding and expansion focus. We're excited to see that move every year. We also work broadly around expanding opportunities with career and technical ed and career exploration for not just K-12 students, but even higher ed. An exciting one that's happened in the past couple of years is an income-based gap funding for higher ed. And I'm sure we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but it really supports students who may be financially struggling, particularly as they near the end of their college career. And it's legislative priority that I know a lot of us have been working on for a number of years. So it's exciting to see that now in place. Broadly expanding career opportunities around higher education. My particular focus is around the early college work experience, those co-op, internship, exploration programs that happen around freshman and sophomore year for a lot of students, or early in their technical career. So those are very important for career exploration and making determinations about where a student is going for their potential career, and also to give them a little bit of work experience in a particular field if they don't have that, going out of higher ed. The last one I'll mention is adding a teacher endowment for the technical college system, particularly for high demand classrooms. As you can imagine, in those high demand workforce areas, particularly around areas like nursing and CDL licensing, and a lot of these others that are in super high demand, teachers can often make substantially more outside of the classroom than they can inside the classroom. So we've been supportive of adding an endowment for the technical college system to supplement the standard salaries for those high demand classrooms as a way to keep our instructors teaching. So those are just a few of our legislative priorities.
Thanks so much, Tim. And I know we've enjoyed working on a number of those issues together. And certainly a lot of them have been things we've focused on for a few years now. All good things. Katie, turn it over to you to kind of share a little bit about you and what you cover for the Chamber, and then some of the Georgia Chamber's legislative priorities related to education and workforce.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing me to join you and Danielle and Tim to talk a little bit about workforce. My name is Katie Duvall. I'm Director of Government Affairs here at the Georgia Chamber. I've been here since June, but before that, I worked in government affairs for about 7 years, mostly in the agriculture sector. So at the Chamber, we cover a broad range of issue areas, definitely more than just agriculture, that affect the business community across the state. We've had some staff changes that have allowed for me to dabble in a little bit of all of these issues in the past 6 months. But my main focus areas are economic development and taxation, health and wellness, energy and environment, transportation, and federal affairs. But I am here to talk to you today a little bit about K-12 education and workforce. And then, of course, the education and workforce, or the war for talent, has been a longtime priority of the Chamber. Our legislative priorities reflect that. Without a strong labor pipeline, obviously Georgia's businesses, all both large and small, will suffer. I'll touch on a couple of our efforts and priorities to address the state's labor crisis. Of course, we support policies that improve college persistence and completion rates so that we can provide an employable and adaptable workforce once they get out of college. We need those students to finish so that they can go on and be in the workforce. We'll touch on this a little bit later when we talk about the subcommittees that have been taking place over the summer, but one of our big priorities is to promote those efforts that better align our K-12, higher ed, technical college systems along with the industry needs, make sure that what our students are learning can be adaptable in the workforce to build that effective pipeline. We support policies that reduce regulatory barriers to employment to ensure that the private sector can meet those workforce needs. We support efforts to address the current workforce housing access and affordability challenges. We'll touch on that a little bit later as well, to ensure that communities across the state can attract and retain the talent, and that the folks that they need for these jobs can afford to live where they're working. We promote policies that increase awareness and access to higher ed opportunities for Georgians and DACA recipients, as well as the return on investment of a degree program based on anticipated income. And finally, we support additional college and career advising to improve student outcomes. So a number of things that the Georgia Chamber prioritizes. Like I mentioned, the war for talent is one of our CEO's biggest priorities. So something we continue to work on over the years.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. And I know we've worked with Tim and the Metro Chamber on a lot of those college advising, persistence, the gap funding. I think, Tim, that you mentioned that the colleges like Georgia State have done really well with their Panther grant, which has been super successful. And then TCSG's funded their foundation to do some of that, which has been really cool. But I think you both talked a lot about those study committees that have been active. And I think there's been a number of study committees that have met kind of over the summer and fall, touching on a variety of things for workforce, because it's been such a big issue for the entire state. So Katie, I'll first go to you, and then Tim, about kind of activities of those study committees and any takeaways that y'all have, and things that we think, we could kind of expect from a workforce community, of things that may be coming down the pipe, or maybe findings that these groups have come to that may be either consistent findings, they continue to come to these conclusions, or any new results too.
Sure. So Chairman Chuck Martin, he has been chairing the House Higher Ed Workforce Development Subcommittee, and it met a number of times over the summer and fall. They heard from industry leaders and education leaders on the struggles of both filling the jobs that are available across the state, and the innovative ways that the K-12 tech school and higher ed system are tackling this challenge. Their final meeting isn't until next week, but Chairman Martin's been focused on solutions throughout this entire process. He's outlined problems for legislators, ways to find these solutions. He's brought in district leaders, business leaders, CEOs of companies, those that are really on the front line of this issue, so that they can come together and think about ways that the state could go about solving this. It's been a very productive few months with that committee, and I'm looking forward to seeing kind of what their final report is. And Tim may be able to touch a little bit more on some of that. Another committee that's been meeting is the House Study Committee on Regulation, Affordability, and Access to Housing. That was chaired by Dale Washburn. I have not been directly involved in this committee myself, but I know Daniela and Seth Milliken with the Georgia Transportation Alliance, who is an affiliate of the Chamber, have been very hands-on. But this is really just focused on that lack of affordable housing that is leading and contributing to a workforce shortage. Like I mentioned, there's companies like Kia. I live in Morgan County, where the Rivian plant's being built, and then there's Hyundai, of course, near Savannah. And these companies are coming in, and it's a great economic development opportunity for the state, bringing in thousands of jobs. But with those jobs comes the need for folks that are maybe making only $17 to $25 an hour. They need a place that they can afford to live. And I can personally speak to the Morgan County housing crisis. Homes in Morgan County are off the charts in terms of cost right now. And if you're only making $25 an hour, A, there's not many homes available, and B, you can't afford to live in them if they are available. So that committee's really been focused on tackling that challenge, figuring out innovative ways to solve it, and make homes affordable for these workers that are so important to furthering the economic development success in our state. Of course, there's no shortage of job shortages across these industries, like Daniela mentioned earlier, whether it's nursing, construction, retail, food service, agriculture. All of these people need places to live, and they need the ability to live in the communities that they're serving. So those committees have both touched on ways to fill those jobs and ways to make sure those workers have a good place to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I think hopefully the report from the Housing Study Committee will come out soon too. And then I know we've also kind of been involved with Chairman Brian Strickland's had his occupational licensing task force. And Georgia Justice Project, they presented, I know, to this group, Max, about some of those opportunities for reform too. So very curious to kind of see how that all continues to fold out, but certainly a number of issues. But Tim, I want to go to you. I know too, we've worked on that Chuck Martin study committee both together. And I know you've been following some other committees too with the Metro Atlanta Chamber.
Yeah, that the higher education, I guess it was a subcommittee maybe. The thing I found fascinating about working together on that was a couple of things. One was just the breadth and scope that committee, which is mainly from higher education setting. So they normally focus on college, university level, but they really took a broad look from all ends of the spectrum, down to, I think we have a speaker for childcare at the December 14th meeting, all the way through the employers and what they're seeing on the far employment end. So it's been encouraging that our legislators are looking at all of those different pieces in the workforce pipeline. So that's been a really good thing. I'll just speak on behalf of the chamber that it's also been really encouraging that employers were really well represented at those meetings and talking about the talent struggle and challenges and some of the successes that they're seeing in the workforce system. So that's been super encouraging to see that. The other thing I'll say about not just that higher ed committee, but around a number of the other committees, a couple which I'll mention in a second, is that there has been a constant refrain about employers asking for programs that are working at scale. So when we have something that is working maybe in a localized or in a small fashion, there's a constant call to expand those programs at some type of scale, so that it's not just a localized success or just a small program success, that there are ways that we can expand and move that across the state. So that's those conversations have been encouraging. I want to mention the Senate had a study committee around school funding. And for those of us who've been around the Capitol a long time, this comes up as a quite regular topic. The Quality Basic Education, or QBE, funding formula that the state uses to distribute the state portion of funds among school districts comes up quite frequently, in particular that our state, while that funding formula for its time was very ahead of its time, it is now about 40 years old and does not include a poverty or income marker anywhere in it, which puts us a little behind the times. So I think hopefully we'll see a continued call for adding that in to either the existing formula or a revamped formula. That would be a very welcome thing. And then the last one I'll mention is a study committee by Senator Halpern in the Senate, which focused around the economic impact and influence that our HBCUs have in Georgia. That's been a really encouraging thing to see. We know from the employer side just how important that the proximity to talent, and particularly these campuses, is, and that the connections that employers have, not just with our large universities, but these HBCUs as well, is really important. So I think talking about the economic impact and the influence that these institutions can have has been a really encouraging thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that both of you hit on was really that engagement from K-12 solutions, whether it was district leaders coming to testify, having our higher education institutions engaged and plugged in and talking about what they're doing, but then also having employers say, hey, this is what we're have that's working, this is what's not working, and then kind of have that gap. So I think both of y'all really talked about that full pipeline look. And so I think that is something that's super helpful, because we know that we can't kind of just focus on one piece of the puzzle. We need to look at the whole big picture to kind of think about our workforce issues. But would love any thoughts too, kind of along those lines around maybe how engagement's been different this year than in previous years.
I'll let you touch on that, Tim.
I think a lot of it's, I'll just say, sometimes that it takes sort of different ways of thinking at the state capitol a little while to sink in. And I do think that the employer engagement side speaks to just the long-term efforts that Chamber's been making at the Capitol. Not just Chambers, right? We have a number of good allies in the education and workforce space who've been talking about this, the need for employer voice, and the importance to talk about like the real wins and struggles that are happening out there, rather than just sort of a generic only looking at the numbers or only hearing secondhand. That employers showing up and being in person is super important, not just on like a higher ed workforce subcommittee, but across all of these issues that impact their ability to do good work in the state. I hope that answered your question, Danielle.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a curveball for both of y'all. So thank you. Really appreciate it. So I know too, there are always those issues that are unexpected at the Capitol, but is there anything that we think is actually going to, maybe be introduced this year, or things that y'all have heard that we should kind of be mindful of and anticipate? We always know that unexpected stuff just happens, and we'll bear with it as it does. But Tim, anything that y'all are looking for to be introduced this session?
Yeah, we're expecting more work around how to stem the teacher shortage. There was a governor's bill last session that tried to address some specific areas about bringing allowing retired teachers to come back in the classroom. I think it was up to like 50% of the time or 60% of the time, even after retirement, to fill in some gaps. I would expect that those conversations will continue to be a big focus. How do we increase the teacher supply, have more students enrolling in our colleges of education? All of those questions, I think, will be top of mind, and certainly will be pushed from our local districts to their representatives. A renewed focus around literacy, I think, is going to be a constant topic. There have been a number of not just study committees, but hearings and everything else for a number of years. I think that there's a broad consensus among representatives and senators of both parties that the state needs to have a deeper look or a deeper dive into literacy, and really doubling down on a lot of the strategies that are working in that, particularly the early literacy space. And I also just personally really appreciate the renewed focus around adult literacy and a lot of the work that our nonprofit organizations like Literacy Action and others and our technical college systems do in that space. I think it's one of those unsung heroes of the workforce system, just the amount of work that happens there. So there may be some legislation that's happening to tackle literacy issues. And then the last one I'll say is just around the idea around choice and scholarships and education savings accounts. Having been through a few new cycles, it seems like every time we have a large batch of new legislators coming in, that's a topic that comes up frequently. So I would expect to see that back on legislative calendars again.
Yep.
I'll throw in something a little bit out of left field. Again, I don't have a huge education K-12 workforce background, but I did read an article yesterday, and I know the Metro Atlanta Chambers worked on this a good bit in the past about sports betting, and it keeps coming up every year as something that hasn't crossed the finish line quite yet, but keeps coming back up. So you can only imagine at some point it may cross that finish line. And I read an article yesterday about how a number of folks across the state are becoming more open to the idea, particularly if it goes on to fund K-12 and goes on to fund higher education. So not directly related to workforce or education, but I think it could potentially make an impact, especially as we continue to want folks to be able to afford to attend school, whether that be technical college or higher ed, and like we mentioned, to complete school as well. So could be a fun and interesting way to tackle that crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think usually, and Tim, I think it's usually for like increasing pre-K slots, and then needs-based aid is kind of generally what they talk about with sports betting, which I think both things opportunities in the state too to increase our education system.
Yeah, the sports wagering, it is a priority for the Metro Chamber in getting that passed. It sometimes gets conflated with other sort of larger gaming bills that have been flowing around out there, but our focus has been pretty pretty narrow, I'll say that, around the sports wagering effort. We are coming down to the handful of states who do not have it. So the idea that it's somehow out of the state is ridiculous. That there are people here that are engaging in it, whether they do it here or whether they do it in Vegas or wherever they happen to be participating. But that it is a potential source of consistent revenue, particularly for the gap funding, which we mentioned earlier. So we will continue to keep pushing and try to get that new revenue stream in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been on the same page for that one. If we can increase those dollars for education, get more folks into our higher education system and expand that early learning, those have been huge priorities. So we've talked about everything, related to workforce, K-12, things like that. But we know there's a number of other issues at the state capitol that'll be introduced and can always kind of, change what the tenor of the state capitol is like and what issues are important. Are there any other issues kind of that are top of mind for legislators that might be not related to education and workforce? And before y'all do that, just wanted to remind everyone, if y'all have got questions for Tim or Katie, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A. So again, any issues kind of top of mind for legislators, and Katie, we'll start with you this time.
Obviously, inflation is something that Georgians continue to deal with, and the governor has recently announced a plan to pivot towards other measures. He's had the gas tax cut for the past several months, but he did announce that will be ending after the holiday. But he's also mentioned the income tax refund being a priority for next year, again for him, and a property tax break. So I expect that he will be announcing additional measures that are his priorities for the next session in the coming weeks. But I know those are two things that are top of mind for him and legislators across the state. One thing that I've been very involved in over the summer is the Joint Study Committee on the electrification of vehicles. We know that Biden has prioritized EVs as the way of the future. You can't drive down I-20 or I-75 without seeing a number of Teslas and other electric vehicles, but these vehicles don't necessarily, especially as you drive more in rural parts of the state, they don't have the places to charge. We don't have the infrastructure built out at this point to be able to allow for that to be the way of the future at this point. So that committee's been meeting over the summer to figure out the best ways to manage that. Even, we've got the gas tax that helps fund infrastructure, figuring out a way that if we're not buying as much gas in the future, how are we funding our infrastructure projects that keep our roads and bridges safe? So that I think I expect that to be top of mind as well. And kind of built into that, one of the priorities of the chamber and the Georgia Transportation Alliance that relates to the electrification of vehicles is freight and logistics funding. Obviously, we've got to have safe roads. We've got to have bridges that are safe. And I expect that to be a priority, at least on our end and hopefully on the legislature's end as well. And then one thing that's kind of my top priority through my committees that I focus on are tax incentives and supporting and protecting those current incentives and economic development policies that have proven to attract investment and job creation in the state, like we touched on earlier with all these new developments and new businesses that are coming into the state and providing tons of jobs. A lot of them are coming because of the tax incentives that we have, and we want to make sure that we can protect those so that the state can continue to be the #1 state to do business in the future. One other thing, House Bill 1013, of course, was a priority of the legislature last year. It focused on expanding mental health care access in the state. And I expect, especially in the health sector, for that to be a continued focus as well, making sure that those folks that are having mental health emergencies are being taken care of properly, and they have access to that, whether they're in Metro Atlanta or all the way in Albany. We want to make sure that everyone across the state has access to the care that they need, both physical and mental.
Thanks, Katie. Tim, what else are y'all seeing that may be important for legislators?
Yeah, in addition to the ones that Katie mentioned, I think with the large number of new legislators that we have coming in, the budget will be a big round of topics. So it is usually the very first thing that our legislators tackle when they go in. In fact, they take a whole week off to review it and dive into that deep appropriations process. So there'll be a lot of discussion around items in the budget and the overall budget size, et cetera. In addition to mental health, the focus around rural hospitals and how health care is supplied. We even had a touch of it here in the metro with the hospital closing and the impact that that's had. So I do think that will continue to be a big topic, particularly for legislators who are in areas that are really underserved when it comes to healthcare. And the last one that seems to have taken a higher priority than what it has had is around elections and how we handle runoff elections and the cost of doing those. States are getting pretty innovative with how they're tackling that. You've got everything from instant runoff to more aligned and coordinated runoff schedules and all of that. So I think there will be some legislation that's introduced to look at that, or to at least explore different types of voting that avoids those costly runoff elections.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, I think y'all all talked about issues that kind of run the gamut. If you are interested in anything at the state legislature, there's going to be a big topic for y'all. But y'all both talked about the number of new legislators. And I think it's just really important for everyone to, truly understand the shift that will happen at the General Assembly with, I think it's 53 new legislators and totally different leadership in the Senate and House. So Tim, we'll start with you, but, kind of what do you expect with all of these changes at the General Assembly? How is this going to impact how it operates, and maybe what issues come up, and kind of just the speed of the session to what can we kind of think about maybe impacted?
Yeah, the stage set I'll put is that legislature starts quite slow. It's a very slow burn. So if you're into, very slow burn murder mysteries, the legislature should be your jam. So they meet and get basically all they're doing at the beginning is just assigning bills and working on budget. But it's when the committee hearings kick in a few weeks into session that things really start to go at a breakneck speed. So that's just to level set on that if you don't see anything right away, it definitely happens later very quickly. The change I would expect is that the pressure on these new leaders in both chambers is going to be pretty heavy. Just not necessarily a learning curve, but maybe fitting into a new role. They have a lot of new members to wrangle in both parties, in both chambers. So that can either go super well or super dicey. So it'll be interesting to see how these new leadership roles shake out, and what issues continue to bubble and to move, and which ones do not. And then the other thing I'll mention is, usually there are a number of what we call pre-files. So these usually happen in the month of December now. And if you look on the legislative website, you'll see all of these sort of big idea legislative bills that get filed. And sometimes, articles get written about them, et cetera. But I think those of us who work at the Capitol know it's better to just breathe, take your time, and wait and see what actually is moving and what gets heard in committees and what actually starts to become part of the conversation. So I think that's something that I would keep on the radar if you're following news about the Capitol, is to remember that in context of how the system will work. And then the last thing I'll say is, just the committee chairmanships are super important. The knowledge that these chairs and vice chairs, et cetera, build over time is so important to the education system, particularly when you're talking about complicated things like funding formulas and policies that the state handles, policies that the local districts handle, policies that happen in higher ed and the region system. So it's a lot to sort out. So that's what I said earlier, learning curves can be pretty steep. That is definitely one of them. And sometimes it takes a little growing time for these chairmen and chairwomen to adapt to those complicated systems and figure it out, and then actually start to work on solutions. So that's what my challenge part would be on the leadership is some of them are going to need a lot of grace and some of them are going to dive right in. So it'll be really fascinating to see how it all happens.
I'll touch on a couple of things. You mentioned there's 53 new elected officials, so we only have 236 total. That's a large chunk of people who are coming in bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with no experience, and they'll be drinking through a water hose. And Tim touched on how a lot of it for them and both the veterans of the legislature is going to be figuring out how they all work together, what their priorities are, what their priorities for their constituents are. It's also going to be the most diverse legislature the state's ever seen as the state continues to change demographically. It's exciting to see the legislature change demographically as well. And they will also have the most women to ever serve in the state legislature at 81. So as a woman, that's exciting. On top of the new faces, of course, Tim touched on this as well. There's been a changing of the guard in both House and Senate leadership. Obviously, sadly, we lost Speaker Ralston. John Burns will be moving into his role, so seeing kind of how he takes the helm of the House and seeing how that works out will be really exciting. Also to touch on Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones serving in an interim capacity. While she has a very short term, she is the first woman to serve as House Speaker, so that's exciting as well. One other thing I would touch on, you mentioned committee leadership. That is, like you mentioned, Tim, very interesting to see how that will all shake out. And we've touched on the appropriations process, and they just recently announced that Representative Matt Hatchett from Dublin is going to be that new appropriations chair. So we've had Terry England in that role for a while. He was kind of that steadfast leader. So I'm really excited to see how Hatchett takes over that process, which is obviously incredibly important and really the only constitutional requirement of the legislature. So it should definitely be an interesting year just from new people, both on the House and Senate side, new leadership, and then from the government affairs side, we're all kind of on an even playing field, getting to know a large chunk of the legislature at the same time. So should be an exciting year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, a lot of folks from the General Assembly actually are now in like serving as agency officials too, which I think is another kind of, which we didn't, but so all new faces, all new roles, figuring out how everyone's personalities interact and work together will be fun, because that's usually a fun part of the legislature anyways. So thinking about, we've always got understanding that a lot of our workforce challenges are short-term solutions, but a lot require those long-term solutions. Are there any efforts, I know, Tim, you've mentioned them too, and Katie, of those things that we, may start now, but or have even been like perennial issues, but could y'all kind of just remind us of what maybe some of those things are that going to require those longer term solutions? It'll be kind of a conversation this year, but we may require kind of some multi-area efforts to see some focus on.
I can jump. Go ahead,
go ahead.
Katie. Nope, you go ahead.
I was just going to touch on two things. One thing, especially since I've been at the chamber, that I've seen that I think is really important, but it's going to take kind of a mind shift, especially in the minds of parents, and how I was raised in particular is you don't necessarily have to go to a four-year college or university to get a good job. I think kind of working, and this is a longer term solution, I think, is changing the minds of parents, changing the minds of educators, that it's okay to go to a tech school. In fact, you may end up making a lot more money right off the bat if you become skilled in a particular profession. I think working to change the minds of parents, get that mindset of you need to fit a kid's skill set and aptitude and interest with a particular direction that they had their education in. They may not have an interest in getting a liberal arts degree or a science degree. They may be really good at tinkering with tractors, and they could go into a welding degree or go into, there's a number of skilled workforce opportunities that, like I said, I don't want to say been frowned upon in the past, but the higher ed, or not the higher ed system, the K-12 system has been so focused on that four-year degree that I think kind of changing that mindset will be important. And like I said, maybe take a longer term path, but if we can get everyone on that mentality, then I think it will help to build that pipeline in the future. And then one more thing I'll touch on, and Daniela, you've already mentioned it, this is that Georgia Justice Project. It's been working for a number of years to allow for reentry for those folks that may have a criminal record, but again, need to be able to provide for their families. And as long as they're not continuing to have offenses, that they can get back into the workforce and build out that pipeline as well. So just a couple of things that I think could make a big impact on the state in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've been happy to partner with Georgia Justice Project for a number of years, along with Metro Chamber too, around a number of different things too. But I think everyone's seen that too, finding employment actually reduces recidivism, which is a huge opportunity to increase the number of workers, because we continue, I know, Tim, y'all hear it from your members as well as we do. We need more employees. We simply don't have the workforce. So finding more people that we can get into key roles, especially those high demand areas, and those that are licensed, which is really important. But Tim, what are the kind of, I know you've certainly been in the space for a long time. What do you think about those long-term solutions we may be looking at this year?
Yeah, I think there's a need, I will say, to take a deeper look at high demand careers and the high demand career initiative, which big fan of, but it's been in place a long time and it hasn't really had a second look. And I think going on a decade now, we might be approaching. So I would love to see that continued focus around not only have the state having a very clear focus on the careers that are in demand for the state, but also bring that down to a local level, not just metro, but each of our regions around the state have a little bit different flavor of what those jobs and employment and what the future of employment looks like in those areas. You think about the impact that like a Hyundai or a Rivian plant has on a region. It changes the job focus any way you cut it. So making sure that we can localize some of that work and keep it fresh and updated as these events and changes happen is really important, not just for employers, but for education systems, for K-12, for higher ed, for all of it. I think that that is a much needed thing to do, not just in the short term. Some of it will start in the short term, but it's a long-term process to rework that. The teacher shortage and how we look at our colleges of ed, even down into the certifications we do at the early ed side, there is a rework or a realignment that needs to happen there, not just on wages, which is what we hear a lot about, but on the division of work and the amount of work and the amount of school day, and all of those questions are all wrapped into the same issue. So I think that that is a long-term thing with a lot of short-term wins that could be a high priority for the state. I think I mentioned it again. I'm gonna double down on something I just said, which is that teaching as a profession and the elevation of teaching as a profession and modernizing that role from how we've traditionally thought of it just the amount of expertise, and even you could even add technical expertise that our teachers have been through in the past 3 years is unbelievable when you sort of step back and look at it. So I think that is something that we need to have a bigger push on, is how we promote that as a profession and how we support that profession. The expansion around student work experience and career exploration, it is something that we talk about, but it isn't really at scale. We have great school systems that are doing innovative work around that, but it's not scaled for high schools, middle schools, elementary schools all across the state. So that is something I would love to see as a long-term solution. And certainly there are legislators and folks working at the Department of Ed and those of us in the chamber world that know the value of it and would love to see that happen. I think it's just a matter of getting the collective will to push and do something about it. The next thing is around the pandemic recovery, the federal funds, even the governor's discretionary funds, all of those things that were flowing to help mitigate the learning loss and to help mitigate the changes that were needed across K-12. There's a lot of questions about how we're doing that going forward. So if we had this infusion of money for K-12, particularly our Title I schools, we had a lot of schools that didn't get access to that money, and then you have sort of a state or governor's push on what was spent. So there's a lot of questions about what do we do going forward? What impact did that have, and what are we doing going forward? So I would expect we'll probably see some short-term legislation or studies that happen around that. But I would also like to stretch that further and think about, we were on a very slow uptick for a lot of things like reading and STEM and mathematics, and we lost some ground. So how do we not only stop that loss, how do we get back on track for that upward increase around student achievement? And then I'll just say again that you mentioned it, Katie, a minute ago about the focus from 4-year off of 4-year. It's such a cultural shift, right? Basically, since World War II, we have been in that everyone should go to college push. And now we're trying to say, yes, but we don't mean 4-year. It's any type of post-secondary is necessary. So I'll use one example that I think is just fascinating. As a recovering farm boy from where I grew up, it is fascinating to me that we have drones running farming machines that are not manned by a person, but by a person back at the farmhouse with an iPad. Is mind-blowing to me, but it's also a good indicator of where both the expertise and level of a lot of industries are going, especially for an industry like agriculture that is so big to Georgia and to our economy. The fact that that industry is already adapting to a much more technical field should give us a really strong indication of how our education, workforce, and training systems have to realign to that new world, because we've been saying for years, like, it's coming, right? We've been saying it's coming, and now it's here. So I think that is an important shift that we need to acknowledge and then respond accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, we've all talked about COVID being an inflection point and things like that, but I think it's certainly accelerated so much digital transformation that we kept knowing was coming. And then everyone said it's, everything got accelerated by 5 to 10 years and it's here, which is super fascinating. But I think too, I'm so glad you mentioned certainly the teacher shortage. I know SREB has done some really interesting research on this too. So if you're interested in kind of diving a little bit more about what it looks like and what it looks like across the Southeast, they've got some great resources. And the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education did a report recently too around the funding from COVID relief funds and kind of how you do that. But I couldn't agree more, Tim. Some of these big, huge issues that we're always there. I think, we certainly all talked about it. A lot of these issues aren't new, but they just got so much worse during COVID. And then now we have to figure out, okay, now that we've seen this in a different way, how do we move forward into a more sustainable environment. And we're really, thinking about maybe those folks that continue to get left behind, whether you're, certainly underserved. How can we think differently to build better programs that are more effective? But any other thoughts? I know y'all both talked about so many different things. I think given a lot of food for thought for the group this morning on the long-term stuff.
This is not related to long-term solutions. It's just, I love that we're talking about agriculture on this Metro Atlanta call. And I did a speaking engagement with Tyler Harper, the new ag commissioner, a couple of weeks ago. And it's funny you mentioned technology and the innovative ways it's being plugged into agriculture, because the title of that session was agriculture. It's not just cows, plows, and sows. So it's exciting to see that moving forward. And people who, may not have ever thought that agriculture, for example, was a career that they could be involved in, being able to use their Georgia Tech degree or their tech school degree to go and plug in a way to help the state's #1 industry.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Everything's getting, and I think, Tim, you mentioned this about not everyone needs to go to 4-year university, but everyone needs something, because every job is just getting that much more challenging. You can't kind of come out of high school, and kind of have the same kind of success. You need something else, because every job is becoming more technical, because we are seeing this huge shift in digital transformation in every industry. It's really exciting. And I think if you look at all the trends and stuff, it's not that robots are replacing people, but it's that robots are really taking so much of these mundane tasks that could be automated, and then it allows people to do work that are more, requires more critical thinking, and really what humans are good at is that processing and that thinking through and the adaptation to adjust. So it kind of creates better work for humans, which is a cool thing, but it certainly requires everyone to be more skilled than they kind of ever have been before. So a huge shift for us to think through. So I know we got one question from Joshua Williams about resources to help people with mental health barriers, access employment and things like that. I wasn't sure if y'all were aware of anything that was in that the mental health bill last time that may be a resource, but to welcome anyone on the call that may know of resources to help those folks that are having some kind of mental health barriers, how they can access employment, or if you've got services with your entity. But Tim, Katie, do y'all remember of any of specific resources that were in that bill?
I don't remember anything specific on that one. I think it definitely did a lot more to better connect the spider web of supports that are out there. I will say there have been a number of initiatives from I'm blanking on the committee. I know Sharon Cooper's committee in the House, the work that Katie Dempsey's done around youth mental health services to allow intercoordination among agencies. So it doesn't matter how the individual is coming into the system, whether it's through a local workforce development board, whether it's through an agency, that the ability to transfer that person's care from agency to agency is super important. So it's encouraging that that's happening, but I don't think it's quite happening at the scale that we want yet. There's positive moves in that direction, and certainly the House Bill 1013 was a move towards that. And the work that Sharon Cooper's committee is doing in the House, I think, speaks to that as well. Just allowing that only needing a person to come in through one door and not have to go to multiple agencies to get the type of support that they need is good to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that, other than I do think I don't want to compare it to the second chance hiring, but I think it is something that could be explored in the future as mental health continues to be a conversation that's had at the Capitol, how we can plug those folks either back into the pipeline or engage them in the pipeline to adapt to whatever their mental health issues may be, making sure that they're in a role that fits their capabilities and their interests as well.
And I think from the employer side, I do think that it has become more part of the conversation, particularly for our HR and benefits managers and the folks that tend to get those types of requests from the employee angle. I think that it has definitely become more in the family of the benefit offering, to where I think maybe pre-2020 you didn't necessarily see that as part of that package, just like you would, for different types of healthcare. And mental health is now, I would say, pretty embedded in that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we continue to hear more about mental health as part of kind of everyone's healthcare benefit offerings. So it's great to see that there's more support and more resources, because I think it will, support a stronger and healthier workforce that allows our state to be more productive, and I think individuals to be healthier and be able to contribute more. And Tim, thanks for dropping those links in if you want to learn more about the GPEE work or SREB. But, I think we're getting a little close on time, and so want to be respectful, but any thoughts too, just on, opportunities for Max members to kind of track session, or what would your tips be? I know, Tim, you kind of shared some things, don't fret if a lot's not happening in January, more will happen for sure. But what are some tips and tricks about what people should be looking for in the legislative session, and how they should engage, and what would be helpful for Max members to do in terms of kind of sharing any thoughts or resources or solutions with either of y'all?
The first thing I'll say is stay local. So wherever you are based, whether it's your company you work for or you individually, start with your local rep, senator first. I think that it's one of those areas that an advocacy that we say, but you just have to keep repeating it to drive it home, which is having those connections with your local leaders who represent you at the state capitol is super important, and that they know what your challenges and wins are, so they have that in their briefcase when they're of their mental briefcase when they're sorting through these issues. So if you haven't done that already, I would encourage you to do it before session starts. And then the second thing would be to breathe as these bills start to come through, and to realize that often there are 5, 6, 7, 12 iterations of the same piece of legislation. So sometimes what gets reported or what you see isn't necessarily the piece that's moving or the piece that's going to be passed and ultimately signed by the governor. So there is a need for understanding that there are so many chess pieces moving on these big issues that you really have to watch and pay attention. And it is where hopefully, if you can't be at the Capitol, you have a representative at the Capitol, you can rely on trusted organizations, whether it's anybody on this call or whoever you trust for that direct interaction, to provide that feedback to you about this is what's actually moving, this is what the real meat or the problem or the crux of the issue is for this piece of legislation. And I think that's where it's really important to have a trusted partner in what you're doing. And local chambers and Metro and State Chamber can be a big partner for that.
Yeah, I'll just highlight what Tim said. I think it's so important for you to have a relationship with your local delegation. When they have an issue come across their desk or across the floor for a vote, if they don't have somebody that they can think of that's been affected by that, they may not think that it actually impacts their constituents. I know, for example, my parents are in Athens, and a big bill came across the floor last year, and their senator did not vote for it. And I asked him later about it, and he's like, well, it doesn't really impact anybody in my area. And I was like, no, actually it impacts my parents. They're in your district. But my parents didn't have that relationship with that legislator to be able to reach out and say, hey, by voting no on this bill, X, Y, and Z are the ways that my family is going to be impacted. So I think it's so important to have those relationships. They meet a ton of people, but they are representing every single one of their constituents. And like I said, if they can think back to a particular person that's being impacted by a bill, that will either A, help them get it across the finish line, or B, make them do what they can to stop it if it's going to be harmful. So I think that's so important. If you haven't been at the Capitol, I told someone yesterday, you either love it or you hate it, but it's always something that I think you should come see once, especially now that COVID restrictions are starting to lift a little bit more. The past couple of years have been a little difficult, but stop by, come call on any of us if you want us to show you around and show you the ropes. It it is quite an experience, but it keeps the ball rolling and ultimately allows for us to be able to do what we do, both in our jobs and y'all's jobs. So I think it's really important.
And we'll just, again, echo what Tim and Katie said. They do check their email. They do look at how many kind of voicemails. So if, even if you don't know them personally, email their, email account and say, hey, this is important to me. Hey, this is something, I'm going to phone call and leave a message. They do track all of that to kind of see what the tenor is. And if their inbox is getting flooded, generally they'll know it's something that's important. So don't be afraid to use those things. But again, Tim and Katie, I want to thank you both for being with us and sharing your insights. Session begins on January 9th. Tim shared the website for the General Assembly. All you can see is they update committee chairs and any bills that are dropped. So too, if you've got any questions, I know that Joy will send out our information too, if you want to reach out further or kind of continue to have an open dialogue. But want to thank Katie and Tim again, and then thanks everyone else for joining us this morning. And with that, we'll adjourn for this morning. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Daniela. Thanks, Katie.